last devotion, it's Friday's devotion on this theme called In Chaos, and with a particular emphasis on enduring. I've over the last 2 days just spoken out of Deuteronomy chapter 8, and there's something in Deuteronomy chapter 8 that is so important. You know, Deuteronomy chapter 8 tells us that God was testing their hearts to see what was in their hearts. You know what He wanted to see? He wanted to see endurance. He wanted to see faith. He wanted to see obedience, and He wanted to see humble hearts. And as the people responded in that way before God, God was going to carry them through into the promised land. I want to say to you today that there's something that God says which is so significantly important. You see, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, He highlights that they were so desperate for Him, that they needed Him so much. They needed miracles from Him to feed them, to clothe them, for them to drink. And God came through every time. But in their moment of crisis, they were so desperate for God's presence and for God's intervention. God says later on in that chapter, you know what, when you're in the good land, are you still going to be so desperate for me? And I'm paraphrasing that into my language. And that's the question that you and I have to wrestle with. You know, in our times of crisis, when we are desperate for God, we press into Him and we hold tightly onto Him and we obey Him and we have faith. But you know what, when things turn, and they will turn, because we serve a faithful God, when they turn and we're back into the good land, and where you were unemployed, you're employed, and where you were so scared because of the COVID pandemic, and when it passes and that's no longer there, are you still going to be desperate for God? Are you still going to have that default position of wanting to just press into God because you're so desperate for Him? What God was teaching the nation of Israel is that when they were in their chaos, and that desperation they felt is not just for times of chaos, but that's the way He wants us to live our lives. Absolutely desperate for Him. I want to encourage you, whether life is good or whether life is bad, whether you're under the weight of everything that we're dealing with today in this world, in this country, or when it turns and everything turns and life is great again, are you going to remain desperate for God? Because that is, I think, what God is asking from us, is that irrespective of the circumstances, that our hearts yearn and long and are desperate for Him. You have a fantastic weekend. And again, I just pray that God's presence and God's love will be around you in Jesus' name.